Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's American Ambulance Association webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording link and slide deck will be published in the next digest for AAA members. To ask questions, please use the Q&A function and chat box at the bottom of your screen. We're super excited for today's webinar, and with that, I'm going to pass it over to Scott.
Well, thank you, Emily. Appreciate you hosting the webinar, putting this on. I think this is the webinar that we've had, hands down, the most registrants for, at least in my 10 years of doing work with the American Ambulance Association. So today's webinar, we're talking about the new DEA registration rules. Many of you know my name is Scott Moore, a longtime EMS, like 36 years, the AAA's operations and HR consultant. And I think funny enough, I don't handle medications. I'm not a paramedic. I didn't think I could get through the cardiology or the pharmacology piece. But as one of the resident lawyers here for the AAA, have of course read through and digested those regulations as best I can. And what we're going to try and do today throughout this webinar is to at least provide you with some guidance and at least point you in the right direction. So just in doing that, one of the things that I think the AAA does and does very well is tries to find folks who happen to be subject matter experts around these various issues. And we feel very lucky, our sponsor for today's webinar, and really because LogRx is a product that actually these regulations they're directly related. So our sponsor and the CEO and founder of LogRx, Clive Savakul, is here. He is sponsored, graciously offered to sponsor, as well as longtime paramedic, has been a fire chief a couple of times over, been working since the mid 90s, and today really, I think saw this opportunity after years of work in the field and to build a program that really is geared towards higher levels of accountability and ease in the use of medications in the field. And if you have not ever gone to the website, certainly you absolutely should. There's tons of resources there for folks to utilize. Clive, thank you so much for your willingness to sponsor and also for offering your insight and expertise today. Additionally, we have Dennis Wishern, who some of you may have seen before, hopefully not in the law enforcement context. Dennis is a retired DEA agent, but also a partner at Prescription Drug Consulting, where really he focuses on DEA compliance. Who better than someone who for 30 years ran the Chicago Field Division? But Dennis has got a lot of experience around not only these regulations, but medication regulations across all the healthcare spectrum. Dennis has done multiple presentations before with Clive, trying to help EMS agencies with compliance in general and just best practices. And we always send out I'm not sure, actually it looks like the slides are right in the chat already. Emily's on top of it. So if you click on to the links anywhere there's an underlined text in any of these presentations, it is a link to either the resources that we utilize, whether it be the regulations, or in this instance, there are two. I've watched both of these. They are fabulous resources for folks or anybody in your organization who handles, whether it's your narcotics control officer or any of your logistics folks. So again, anywhere you see underlined texts, you can follow those. These are fabulous programs that both Clive and Dennis have hosted in the past. Now, again, you guys, for those of you who've been on webinars with me before, you know full well that the first thing I always tell you is don't rely on anything I'm about to tell you is legal advice. I'm not your lawyer, association's lawyer, right? If you need a lawyer, we can certainly help you find one. And you can just go into hello@ambulance.org and we can sort of point you in the right direction. But what we're trying to do today is educate you, inform you, so that you can go out and find the resources that you need. Around and related to the DEA. Now, we do a whole host of webinars. We do a bunch of them over the course of the year. And as is always, one of the reasons you join the American Ambulance Association is so that you can get access to those resources, right? For example, we will be putting out, it's just a basic checklist that we put together. I will tell you, it's as comprehensive as it can be, because one of the things that I've learned when prepping for this webinar is, depending upon where you are and what state you are in, it will control exactly how this process goes for you. So while there is this federal regulation, what we still have, as many of you know, there's federal law that sets the floor, and then state law that sets the ceiling. So if you have any questions throughout today or sometime in the future, and we had some folks already reached out this morning, just email hello@ambulance.org. What that does is go into our ticketing system, which then allows the team over at the AAA to be able to direct the question to whatever subject matter expert we have. And so, for example, if a question comes in about this, it'll probably come to me first. And then if we need to, we will put you in touch with Clive or with Dennis. So today's goal is quick history of the rule. Many of you, this is not your first rodeo. You already know a lot about how this rule got here. We're going to talk about some of the problems that the rule was hoping or, trying to solve. Talk an overview of the rule, explain the storage and administration requirements within the rule, documentation requirements, much of which, we know like Clive's product does a fantastic job at helping and assisting with some of those documentation requirements. Again, if you watch those other two programs, you will see there's extensive background on how that all works. And then we'll talk about, some implementation and compliance safeguards. So just a quick history of this rule and how we got here, right? And we're going to talk more formally. So I'll just kind of buzz through this and then we'll hit each point a little bit more. Really, prior to 2010, right? Informal drug access model, depending upon where you were, depending upon if you've seen one EMS agency, you've seen one EMS system. 2010 to 11, there were a bunch of regulatory actions that sort of exposed the issue around and this is, likely through enforcement actions. But then, the industry and the profession started to really advocate for, we need some standards. This is an area where the federal government really should be. And we should be looking for some sort of consistent, no matter where you are, you get a relatively, at least a floor of a requirement. 2017, Congress passes the act back in November of 17. DEA starts the rulemaking process. And this was like trying to push the Titanic, I think, through Jello. And that process went on for a very long time. DEA finally, there were a ton of comments submitted, and looking at the comments that were submitted, they were extensive, many around things like what's a station house or including station house as a potentially designated location, etc. So DEA then finalizes those rules back in February of 2026, and then the rule took effect yesterday. So the rules took effect yesterday, and depending upon where you are, and depending upon how this process goes for you, for example, I'm in Massachusetts, and what I have learned is that you are not required to get registered in Massachusetts. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So why does the rule matter? I think really the intent here is to, one, DEA creates a new registration category, right? Prior to this, EMS really was not a registration category. And in many states, you'd see their regulation. For example, my state, it says that DEA registration is required. So funny enough, when I contacted the controlled substance folks, they said, you've contacted the wrong agency. You need to call the DEA. And I said, well, actually, I'm asking you because the regulations say that you need to get it. And then I found out subsequently, great folks over at Mass Controlled Substance Division, but they said, oh, we talked with them and turns out you don't have to, which I thought was interesting. If I was confused, I would imagine you all would be confused as well, because I spend a fair amount of time reading regulations. So this permits a single registration, whereas before you might have had to have multiple registrations for every location where you might be keeping medications. We're going to talk more about that as we go. And then really clarified how you handle controlled substances. Again, anywhere you see a little underline link at the bottom, you're going to be able to follow that to the underlying regulations. If you want to go through the Federal Register, it's a boatload of fun, I will tell you. So, Dennis, do you want to pick up and sort of give just a little bit of background on sort of what the historical EMS access, because I would imagine in your time at the DEA, you spent a fair amount of time looking at this.
You bet. Thanks, Scott. Historically, and the big challenge with the EMS and the CSA and the CFR, and when I say that, the Controlled Substance Act and the Federal Code of Federal Regulations, my apologies. Both of those were created in 1970. They're over 50 years old. And what happened is they primarily focused on medical providers, doctors, NPs and PAs, pharmacies, and hospitals. The writers back then, 55 years ago or 56, did not take EMS in. And if you actually look in the CSA or the CFR prior to DA's action, there's no mention of EMS. And it's an important first responder, public safety office and experts that the nation needs. I believe DA documented in the Federal Register there were 60 million calls in 2024 responded. So it's very important. But historically, Scott, as you ask, EMS was either registered through a hospital and received their drugs from the hospital pharmacy with the medical director oversight, or maybe a private ambulance contracting out with a doctor to provide the CMO, and then getting the drugs from the doctor's registration himself, which doctors are allowed to do. And as you mentioned, winding up, the reg actually established uniform, at least federal requirements for the first time. And I liken this somewhat to reverse distributors. That's a distributor that takes back expired drugs. There was never no mention of that type of professional in the regs either until 2014. So it's really DA with Congress's help tweaking the regs. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think, many of the folks on this webinar certainly have experienced that. I think, if you were a single location, I've heard from folks in some of the rural, super rural areas that access was actually a challenge, depending upon, the system that you worked with. But if you were a large organization that had multiple locations, and if you were in multiple states, it really became a significant challenge. And so I think this comes down to, right, there wasn't, prior to the federal sort of floor, right, setting a universal or at least one standard, there wasn't a great, how do we track medications? And as we know, right, we're not in a day and age where we shouldn't be able to. The technology exists where this is possible, right? And so as a result, there should be greater accountability, and it should be relatively easy to do so. And depending upon how you do that, it can be, right? So the goal is that I think, the DEA wants to know who has medications, where are they being kept, making sure they're being kept in a manner that they're supposed to be, and then how do they move about your organization or amongst other registrants. And that's really what was a major challenge before. There really wasn't clear authority over who had, EMS, frankly, the regulations around their right to move or dispense medications, it was really not terribly clear. So we were really looking to improve the accountability process of this and make sure that, in fact, at any one time, that could be, they could know where things were. So I don't know, Dennis, you want to pick this one up as well? Oop, sorry about that. Yeah.
No, I'm with you, my friend. And just as Scott mentioned, and this is in line with what I previously said, in like the Veterinarian Mobility Act allowed the same thing, sort of. And that was an act in 2014, which allowed the veterinarians to take controlled substances out to the field. Historically, DEA does not like to tweak the regs without Congress pushing them through a federal law, much like the Protecting Patient Access to Emergency Medication Act. That's a mouthful, 2017. But then it did tell DEA, it's like, okay, DEA, come out with the regs. You're the experts. Promulgate these regs and give a good product to the specialists that need it out in the field, like the EMS. I'm much like you, Scott. It took DA way too long. They dragged their feet on these things, and it's really, in my opinion, not responsive. And, I'm a former DA agent over 30 years, but there's got to be a faster, better way. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah. And I worked for the United States Department of Labor. One thing I will say is that it is not a government not known for their swift action. Now, again, I also, having been a federal employee, Dennis, you were a federal employee, I also know that none of those folks are doing it for the money, right? And so they're only able to operate within the confines of the regulations and their charging, their statutes that permit them to do that. So generally speaking, right, I think, Dennis, you were going to hit on this one again about the DEA's role with medical providers.
Yes, sir, Scott. Uh, Often when I'm out in the public speaking, a number of DA registrants really do not, they're unaware of DA's role, but DA's role in the pharmaceutical controlled substances is strictly record keeping and security of the drugs. It's my belief when the lawmakers in the early 70s made DEA and the initial regulations, the Code of Federal Regulations, some people used to call them the DEA regulations because DEA has the power to enforce them. It all boils down to record keeping and security. The practice of medicine is controlled by state medical boards, such as the medical doctor board, the nursing board, the et cetera, the board of pharmacy, teaching universities, and professional organizations. There is no federal medical board, no federal teaching university or whatsoever. Practice of medicine is controlled, as you mentioned, Scott, by the states and how the states control their part. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah, so DEA's role with controlled substances, and you just really hit this, right, is sort of that ability around controlled substances to prevent diversion and abuse of drugs and to ensure adequate uninterrupted supply. Now, I had been the CEO of a very large organization, and a few years after I left, one of the people who we had as our narcotics control officer, little did we know, had been diverting medications for a period of time. The challenge, of course, with that is the person who was in charge of inventorying and tracking and ensuring the logbooks and so forth were appropriate. Again, there wasn't a good check and balance. I think today the goal around this is making sure there's a higher level of accountability, right? So again, I think one of the things that Dennis had shared with us is like, look, there are no medical providers on staff at the DEA, right? Essentially, these are law enforcement folks who are ensuring that the regulations are enforced. That, again, understand that there are numerous mechanisms, and EMS has always been sort of that weird sort of, medical provider where when regulations are drafted, often the oversight entities or the folks who are charged with oversight, they don't quite know what to do with us. We've run into this with HIPAA. We've run into this with the Affordable Care Act. We've run into this several times. They don't quite know what to do with a non-brick and mortar styled healthcare provider, for which, of course, our folks are, we have to be able to bring that stuff to the bedside, and it has to be able to move, in our system. So I think really the goal of this rule was let's essentially create a new type of registration. It will be this EMS-based registration. They sort of listened to the profession, listened to the industry, took tons of comments across. If you go to the Federal Register, you can see all the comments that were submitted. And really the goal was, right, was to create that standing, create an EMS category, authorize standing orders formally by regulation, right, clarified drug storage and administration, and then really pushed on this hub and spoke model. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along here. So who's got to register? And I will tell you, this is a question that I don't know that I have a great answer for, because when I, for example, pulled up the regulations here in Massachusetts, it very clearly says that EMS agencies have to register with the DEA. But when I contacted the folks over at the Mass Controlled Substances, they said, actually, if you're under the existing model, which you have, which is, again, operating under the physician's DEA license at a hospital affiliate medical organization, then you're fine. So it's, in my opinion, this is the toughest part that we're running into, is trying to figure out, okay, who must register? Because even where the language says you must, turns out, well, maybe you don't have to. Earlier this morning, I got a memo. Apparently, the state of Michigan published a memo, and that memo said something to the effect of, we are going to be, essentially EMS agencies continue doing what you're doing. We're going to publish more guidance in the coming days. Now, again, that's sort of, I guess, for the message for most people are you can start the registration process, but you are not necessarily required to. And we're doing our best trying to collect information as we go along. So agencies stocking controlled drugs, any organization, EMS organizations, anybody stocking controlled drugs or services storing drugs at stations, right? So this comes back to that idea of a hub and spoke model. And so those who are covered very clearly, the one thing that we do know is if you're a hospital-based EMS agency, you can continue to operate under, right, that hospital DEA license. You can, however, seek a separate registration if you want, but you don't have to. Other than that, it will really, as I said, DEA sets the floor. It will really depend upon your state. So you need to, and I don't know, Dennis, if you've got any insight on this specific about, you know, where or how can an organization determine if, in fact, one, is there any harm in them registering? Which I think the answer to that is no. But you're the expert here. But and where and how might they go to determine, geez, do we have to?
Yes, sir, Scott. You know that historically, I just go back to the history and then I'll get to it real quick. DA will never issue a registration without prior state approval. So examples of that are DA will never give a pharmacy license out without that pharmacy having a state license. A medical doctor, an NP, DA will never give out the federal DEA number, registration, same thing, without having that state number first. So to answer your question, Scott, it's like the way I read the reg, if you've been approved by the state EMS, then you would send that document with your new registration if you wanted to get an EMS registration to DA. But I'm like you, it's going to be a little rocky and gray initially for a little bit till everybody figures this out. But to answer your question, I would call your state EMS point of contact and ask them, much like you did, Scott. It's like, okay, hey, what are the rules? How do you guys see this? I'd like to do it for these reasons. Are you guys okay with it? And start working it up from the state. And again, that goes on the history of the respect for the state's authority over the practice of medicine. Back to
Yeah,
you,
no, I
Scott.
appreciate that. And I know we got here in the chat, it says for the state of Maine, they can't register on the DEA site. The state's Maine is not allowed yet, sort of with a question mark, right? And so I think this comes back to, um, and I don't even know, I would presume, and I don't know, Dennis, if you've got any insight on this, that in the registration process, is there something, does the DEA have or will they be able to block based upon geographic location? It sounds like yes, in that instance.
I would think so too, but I kind of anticipated this question, Scott. There's 2 points of contact. In every DEA field division, there's actually a web address called dea.registration.help at dea.gov. And I'm going to repeat that, dea.registration.gov. No, help, excuse me, da.registration.help at da.gov. I'd suggest sending an email that'll get routed to the appropriate state, and you can try and ask these questions and get something in writing. But I think this goes back to Scott. It's just going to be a little gray and rocky till everybody gets their hands around this. Back
Yeah,
to you,
and
Scott.
yeah, Clive, I think you have something you can add to this as well.
Yeah, I just chime in. We have basically customers in every state, and we've recently had some inquiries with our main customers because of this legislation, and a lot of the agencies will get a drug box from the local hospital's pharmacy, and they basically swap it in and out. So they have a locked seal, they get the kit complete. Once they break that seal, use a drug, they take the kit straight back and swap it out. And so it sounds like the legislation is kind of lagging a little bit there because they're still working under the hospital's DEA license. And so what we've been telling our customers is just keep in tight communication with the hospital and your EMS agency medical director so that you're covered as far as how you're doing business. Because with this registration, it could change those things. And as long as the EMS agency has their documentation in order of saying,
Mhm.
hey, we asked, we're in compliance to start doing business, please give us direction, then at least they're covered to help if they're ever questioned by the DEA.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And I think that this comes back to, right, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. And I think the best indication of what you were thinking at the time that this regulation goes into effect is what efforts you made, what emails you sent, what, again, like I said, had I not reached out to the state office, I would have been telling clients here in Massachusetts, oh no, you got to register. And I actually it was one of the ambulance owners here that said, I'm not so sure that's true, which I thought, well, surely the regulations say you must. And so when I reached out to them, again, this is one of those things that I kept it all in email, right? So that I can say, this is who I spoke to, this is when I spoke to them. And again, I think it's important. So we did have a couple of questions, and I'm not sure. I typically answer questions as we go because sometimes by the time you get to the end for questions, the issues sort of long since passed. But one of the questions came in from Scott, said, I understand one license per state now, but does that mean we can order to other locations or all orders need to be sent to one location? I understand this probably is state specific as we operate in states that with a state drug control and states don't have state drug control. I'm not sure I read that correctly, but I'm presuming that you guys probably understand that better than I do. But the question being is, hey, if I'm going to be ordering medications, right? Well, you have to have one registration per state, and if you're doing it through or as a result of being registered, my presumption would be that you would be ordering to each designated registration site, and then you would be tracking from there. Does that sound right?
Yeah, let me jump in there.
Yeah, please.
I've read the regs several times, and it's like I'm still taking notes on it. But the way I read it, if you're registered, let me give an example. If you have one location registered and you ordered your drugs from a wholesaler, one of the big three, or whoever you get your drugs from, it's allowed to go to that registered site. If you're trying to get from your wholesaler to one of these designated locations, that's this new quote phrase DEA uses that does not need to be registered, but you can house your ambulance there and store drugs. You cannot get drugs from an outside entity sent there. It has to come through your registered location. Does that make sense, sir?
Yeah, for sure. So actually, I guess we should probably just move along and then we'll hit these questions as we go because I think that is helpful because I hadn't really what sort of it the model is a hub and spoke model, right? So there's the registration, which is your main location, and then you have to designate locations if you're going to be storing medications there. So those designated locations can be stations, can be any location where you are storing medications that is part of your organization. Again, it's a hub and spoke model, right? So you're able to move medications from your registration site to your designated location. Of course, there has to be a bunch of tracking and paperwork around that. But so just quickly, the registration overview, right? You apply through the DEA's website. You have to identify a medical director, and then you will list your storage location. So your registered site, and then you have to designate those locations. All right. And those locations, it's anywhere in which you intend on storing medications. So you're going to need your agency information. You're going to need your medical director's DEA registration number, and then you will need the locations of those designated locations. And then they will ask you about security procedures. So making sure probably stuff that you already have in place today, but just going back through, I often find when I do policy reviews for folks that we have policies that have cobwebs on them. They've been around forever. And while policies don't necessarily always change, one of the things I tell people are, at minimum, review your policies once a year, right? Update the last review date because, again, it does for a regulator indicate that you're paying attention. So that's really, really important. So your medical director has to have must hold the DEA registration, right? This is the person who will provide that written authorization and establish those standing orders. Again, super important. This cannot be someone who's really not affiliated with your organization. It's sort of, this is not a medical director on paper only kind of thing. Right? This is the person who will approve those protocols and the QA process around the protocols, right? And the appropriate use of any of those medications, as well as compliance oversight. All right. So again, important that you have an engaged. This is true of pretty much any aspect of EMS service management. You should have an actively engaged medical director, right? We've seen, I'm involved with CAS, the Commission on Accreditation of Ambulance Services, and one of the things that we sometimes see, and we'll find when we go in to do site reviews, it is clear the medical director is not really that engaged. It's someone who is just sort of signed off on everything. That is not what you want. It's not good for your agency. It's not good for your providers. So your designated locations, right, can be EMS stations, ambulances, any satellite storage sites. So you want to identify, where those are. Again, just quickly, I do want to quickly hit, I did see a question come up. For Texas, we already have an MLP-ambulance service license for all of our 52 stations. Do we have to start over or just convert one registered location and 51 designated locations? Is there a form for that yet? I don't know if Clive or Dennis, either one of you have any insight on that. I'm going to guess the answer is probably not yet for a multiple transition, but looks like Dennis, you have a comment.
Yeah, I saw that question too from that gentleman, Scott. I would get in the queue on those designated locations because the way the reg written, it kind of puts it on DA if the gentleman wants to do it. And then after, if the registrant does not hear back from DA within 30 years, those designated locations become good. And this goes back to what you said, Scott, and I often say, Big Brother wants to know where all your drugs are kept. So in the old days, every spot that kept drugs, a pharmacy, a hospital, ketamine therapy clinic, whatever, had to be registered, which showed DA in the state where drugs are kept. DA's created this new definition. Let's call it this phrase, designated location. That location, the designated location, does not have to be registered. However, DA still wants to know about it. And what I find kind of maybe innovative about DA, this doesn't save anybody paperwork because the same paperwork from a registered location has to filter down to the designated location. But it does save multi-registrations. That seems to be one of the strengths of the regulation. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah, because in the regulation it says that even that paperwork of that exchange has to be kept both at the registered location and at the designated location. And I presume, Clive, this is where your product would actually be really helpful.
Yeah, and we track all the locations and all the GPS activity of the drugs themselves. But I could tell you with the hundreds of agencies we work with, none of the fire departments have DEA registrations for each of their firehouses. They're storing these different drugs in lockboxes. And I see there's a question about registration for each ambulance lockbox. And so I could tell you the real world application from what we see. In fact, we were talking to Joliet Fire Department this morning in Illinois, so it's ironic you got their picture. But the real world application is they get the DEA registration for the agency central location of, say, their EMS office. And that's what we see from our side. But that being said, tracking all of that is key. And so say you get caught out and they say, hey, you didn't have a DEA registration for the second location or whatever. You could say, okay, but here's all of our documentation showing all the activity, our due diligence to make sure everything's accounted for. So maybe not the registrations is perfect as we thought it was. We do have everything accounted for. And so that will carry a lot of weight, as Dennis could probably attest to, if you're ever called out.
Yeah, and one of the things I'll say as a former regulator was when I would call someone up and ask for documentation, and either one, when I asked for their fiduciary or whatever the person was, right? In this instance, it might be who's your DEA, oversight person in your organization. First of all, if what I got was like a hand over the phone that said like, who is our that's never a good thing, right? Like who's our HIPAA privacy officer? That's never a good thing. Number one, it should be very clear who's the person that call will be directed to. Also, if I asked for documentation and it took you 2 weeks to get it to me, index of suspicion stayed here. If you turn that stuff around in an hour or two, right, it immediately drops by 50%. Why? Because again, it connotates that you are on top of your game, that this is something that you're not just doing today because we're requesting it, that it's a part or fabric of how it is that it's part of that compliance fabric that you have over your entire organization. So this comes back to, again, Most of this rule really ties around good documentation, good tracking, and understanding where controlled substances are maintained. So, just a quick question that I saw in here is, what about a non-EMS transport agency such as an SAR or ski patrol? Um, I don't believe there's any distinction between. I think it's the same. I think you would have, if you're a licensed, EMS agency, you would register and you would designate those your registration location, designate those any location that you might have, and then, the regulations have a lot in there about, when can someone actually carry medication on their body, and that is when they're actually actively responding to an emergency or to a medical call. Again, so you wouldn't want them rolling around with the medications when they're not actually, engaged in responding. So, I hope, Stephanie, that answers the question. And I think Clive, you already answered Phil's question about storage in the medication boxes, and then all drugs ordered, just from Scott, all drugs ordered from a big supplier would only be able to be ordered on the main site, not the storage site. I'm guessing what you're asking is, if we were ordering from a large supplier, would we be ordering it and shipping it to our registration site and then distributing to our designated sites? And I think the answer to that is that would be the way, that would be consistent with the regulations as currently drafted, right? It's that hub and spoke model. It comes into the main location and then gets distributed to those designated locations. And
With all that, and you want to make sure that all of that is documented. So when you get it, you
yes.
document it, and who is transferring it to which other location within your organization, date, time, who is there, witnesses, and all that needs to be documented.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, this comes back to what they're going to ask is, they're going to come in and say, please furnish us with all the documentation. And what you really want is for someone to be able to, quote, forensically, but be able to go back and go, all right, I see it came in here, then I see it went from here to here, then I see it went from here to here again, so that we can know the life to death of that medication. That's the intent of the statute. If a staff member has taken home a car, does this mean their address has to be on the PPW? Staff member taking home a car that it has controlled substances in it. So, for example, if it's a command vehicle, where, like in my fire department, occasionally the fire chief will bring home the command vehicle, and in that command vehicle will be potentially ALS gear. I'm actually going to let you two answer this question, because, to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure. So
we work with a lot of like wildlife veterinarians, and we do have some search and rescue folks. I saw a question on that in ski patrol, who we also work with, and a lot of them they work by themselves, or a fire line medic who goes out and they take it along with them. And so uh, it's as long as that is being tracked, they're still doing their checks, they're still keeping a tight accountability, then I don't see how that's any different than like an ambulance going out and
yep.
posting up for 12 hours in a Walmart parking lot. So I don't know, Dennis, if there's other legalities with the DEA registration, but that's how I've always seen it from the EMS perspective.
Uh, the only thing I'd add to that, and Clive, both you and Scott are the professionals that have actually done this. Uh, the regs alludes to that the drug should not be left in the ambulance when it's unattended. Now there's always exceptions, but I know from a law enforcement view, at least handling weapons and things like that, you never really want to leave them locked in your vehicle and unattended. So a conservative approach would be, if your back's against the wall, you got to do what you got to do as a first responder, but securing those every night in something better than the car. And then, of course, putting them back in the vehicle when your duty times come up is the preferred way to do it. That's all. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah. So, I've been a little neglectful in the Q&A, so let me come back to the Q&A. So Arizona, apparently state of Arizona did try, and it says that they cannot, when they tried to register, reportedly 20 states unable to apply right now. We tried our local DEA, and they said, we're working on this, with no answers. Thanks for sharing that, Kyle. And it says, our local hospital advised they can exchange controlled substances if used on a patient, but are no longer able to dispense for the expired medication exchange, or if we drop a medication. Does this rule speak to exchanges versus only administered on the patient We are in Phoenix, Arizona. I saw some discussion in the rule about the ability of one registered location to transfer a medication or to restock another registrant. The only thing that's in there is that you just have to make sure you have a good paper trail on that restocking. Restocking is permitted under the regulation. There is nothing. Now, again, there may be some state rule that's different than that. But I will tell you on the federal rule, this rule itself specifically addresses that one registrant can restock another, specifically a hospital can restock an ambulance, provided, of course, that you're doing the appropriate documentation. In reading through, it mentions that you need a separate registration for every state you administer controlled substances. Would this include if you run mutual aid into a neighboring state on occasion, even if you don't house anything in that state? While not specifically addressed in the rule, my thought is your registration is your state specific. If you run mutual aid, it's just that mutual aid. It's not that you're housing those medications. Now, if you were sent over to house overnight there, for example, again, your designated location would be, I don't think in this instance you'd be required to register in that state unless one of you all think differently.
So for the guidance, usually from the Office of Emergency Services is you follow your home policies. And so if you're sent out of state, which nowadays is extremely common, especially on the West Coast, you follow your home county for us policies and procedures, handling of narcotics. And so you still keep tight tabs on everything because it's just unrealistic to go into, Utah and then start assuming or contacting their DEA office, their local EMS agency. They don't have that bandwidth and you have bigger priorities. And so that's why the Office of Emergency Services in different programs with FEMA, they just say follow your own home policies and procedures.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, we may, if we run a little bit over today because we've got a ton of questions on this, we have a ton of folks. Certainly, one of the other things we can always do is maybe do a town hall at another time or something like that. If in fact, because I will say, like for example, taking a look in the questions here, because we're on locked drug compartments and restricted access and so forth. It does say here, units on duty stopping for a break. The regs reference a substantially constructed cabinet. Any advice on what that means? And I think we're all familiar with your standard lockbox inside an ambulance. I would presume, right? I would presume you would want. Here's what I would say. Clive showed not only an actual a narcotics box with a tamper-resistant tab, as well as I would be locking those inside a substantially constructed cabinet with a key or a punch lock or some other access control. Now, if the vehicle is occupied, again, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't still have the narcs locked in a cabinet. But I don't know if either one of you want to comment on if there's beyond sort of what would be a common definition of a substantially constructed cabinet. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, the security isn't just a lock. So the lockbox that I'm holding up, it has a little tamper evidence seal. And, if this got broken into and you said, hey, I had a tamper evidence seal on it, the law enforcement's going to say, no, that's not good enough.
Yeah, that's not a lock.
So like our program, we integrate with the Knox Med Vault because that thing is ironclad. You cannot get in that thing without a circular saw and 20 minutes of free time. And so Dennis, I'm going to put him on the spot because he has a great comment on how well and the types of security that these locks should be. So it's not just some random tin lockbox. It's got to be quality.
Yeah, Clive's spot on as usual. The reg is somewhat similar to, but it's a little beefier than what a doctor has to maintain his or her drugs if they keep drugs in their office. But the DA view is always somewhat subjective. So you really don't want a little cabinet out there or like a little cash box to hold your drugs, because if something went south, the auditor, the DA person would look at it. It's like, that doesn't really fit the definition. So like Clyde said, you want a substantial, strong safe, limited access with swipe card. You want to exceed the regulations and you want to bolt that thing in. And then you're going to be bulletproof if anybody second guesses you that you did not meet the basic requirements of the reg. And keep in mind, you can always exceed the regulations, but I think in security and safes, that's exactly what you want to do nowadays. Back to you,
And,
Scott.
yeah, and Rob Lawrence asked a great question because, ambulance theft is a pretty significant issue. And it still amazes me that with all the security and things that we have today, that ambulance theft is still an issue. But Rob said, one for later, but under the regulations, do they talk about security of controlled substances on the ambulance? Does the ambulance and its security become part of the quote drug box? In other words, if the vehicle is left open, unattended, and stolen, does this now reflect on the DEA licensing of the organization? Well, the regulations do talk about unattended vehicles during an emergency. And what I would say is this. If you have to say technically we were on an emergency and the vehicle, like the regulations say, if you start any sentence with technically, you're first of all heading down a path that I don't think is a successful one. And as a lawyer, I go like, yeah, it's kind of like when someone says, well, to be honest, and I'm like, okay, that means everything else they say is probably not honest. What I would say is these things, not only a tamper resistant so that you can know if someone in your team has been in them, because again, just we always presume it's going to be someone from the outside. Number two, a substantially constructed security, right? In other words, I will tell you that in our service, BLS folks, of course, did not have the combination to the locked cabinet. Why? Because there's no reason for a BLS person to have access to that, right? This is a sort of known. And if the vehicle is left unlocked, one, I would say that you would want, in other words, one, the vehicle's certainly a stolen vehicle is a problem, but you should have significant, it should take a significant effort for someone to get into that cabinet, and those narcotics should be locked up in a manner that, unless that vehicle comes apart upon impact somewhere, right, that those things are not coming out. I don't know if you guys have any other comment you want to add to that, but there are very specific language in here about the vehicle that's locked and that when the vehicle is left inside a base location and is locked, that can be acceptable. But if the vehicle is, let's say, for example, two folks run into McDonald's to grab themselves a Big Mac, again, the vehicle needs to be locked. And I would say, again, you will never get penalized for having multiple access points. You will almost always get penalized for having insufficient security. You guys feel differently on that, or I see you nodding heads, so I think we're probably good there. So I know as I said, we're coming up we got about 12 minutes left here. So I'm going to keep moving and then I will come to those questions at the end. So for those who want to drop off, we talked about restocking, so I won't beat that horse. All four legs of that are in the air. The real important thing, and again, this comes down to, remember, the biggest part of this rule is yes, of course, security, but really it's about the administrative side of the movement of medications through your organization, documentation, and a chain of custody so that we know where a particular medicine went from its like the time it gets to you until the time that it either goes to a patient or goes somewhere else, and that you have all of the documentation. In addition to that, as I said, not only at your registration main site, but then also at the designated location. If you restock from another registrant like a hospital, you have to notify the main registration within 72 hours. But you, again, want to have that documentation to make sure that, in fact, this, again, what they want to know is where at any one point I should be able to take a snapshot and then know exactly what medications you have and exactly where they are, right? So you should have those logs. You really should have a QA process, and you really should have somebody there should be 2 points of failure on whoever your narcotics officer is. Take it from me. Sometimes it's the narcotics officer who's the problem. So making sure that you have a second mechanism, right? Somebody who is keeping that person honest. I'm not, again, suspect of everybody, but 36 months in a federal penitentiary for one of our guys was the end of that. Anyways, anything related to restocking from supervisor to other crew, not specifically in the rule, but what they specifically talk about is when you are moving from one designated location to another, you again have to have the tracking documentation. Clive, looks like you may have something to say on this one.
Yeah, it's just every step needs to be documented. And there's the documentation requirements. There's 11 components that's in the legislate the regulation. And they're there for not just punitive, they're there to help you. And so you look at those as not just guidance, but hey, this is the minimum. Because if you work backwards and think, okay, if I have a diversion, what tools do I have to narrow down how this occurred? And so those 11 things might not be all you want to do. So if you can take any extra steps, like for our program, we take pictures during inventory checks, but anything you can do, not just to catch somebody, but to help keep honest people honest. Like paramedic school is very hard for me. And so I'm not, nobody goes through that to become an addict or a thief to
Oh,
sell narcotics.
yeah.
And so I think that having these are important because it's like driving without a seatbelt. You know, you're fine until something goes wrong, and then it's too late to do anything. And so good documentation is key.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And I think again, it comes down to, right? So for example, in our case, had we had someone watching the narcotics control officer and the medications that we were restocking from the hospital, we would have spotted that, geez, was this inconsistency. But because we had really full faith in this particular individual, again, we didn't have a good QA system, a good check and balance. And again, that works on, some people will say, well, geez, should you have to be watching over your, it works to their benefit as well, right? That person who's a narco officer wants somebody to be making sure that, right, that there's some backup. So, of course, I think we can breeze by this. This comes back to that the protocols exist, that standing orders and or verbal orders that you can administer medications, but really this comes down to documentation, retention of documents, or as I said, I think it's a 2-year standard, Dennis, if we're right on the DEA, but then your state may have a greater retention period.
Okay, that's exactly right, Scott. DA is just 2 years. Many states are 3 years. I know New York requires 3 years. And just as you said, if there's a conflict between the federal rule and the state rule, you have to go with the more stricter of the rules. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah, and again, I see questions popping up in the chat and in the Q&A, and we're going to hit those. I just want to make sure we get through so that those folks who got what they wanted answered can drop off if they want to, and those that want to stay. And I don't know if my co-presenters have a hard deadline, but I just wanted to make sure that that we move through. So required records, right? Your POAs for all. And I don't know, actually, Dennis, I think you were going to cover this slide. Yep, nope, that was me.
No, I got it.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Hey, for the sake of time, I'm going to hit these quick. These are really the core DEA requirements for records, as Clive and Scott have spoken about today. You need a power of attorney for Schedule 2s only. So that's your opioids. And that would be if whose ever license name wanted somebody else to order the 2s, you would need a power of attorney. DEA always asks for that. Initial inventory and a closing inventory, you would only need that when you start up your EMS and maybe close one down. You have to do a biannual inventory for DEA, which is every other year. I call it a snapshot in time. You have to keep your 222s, which is the record for ordering all Schedule 2s. And any 3s through 5s, you have to keep the invoices at least 2 years. Clive mentioned it, his system's outstanding at this. There are now 11 required data points you have to keep records when you administer drugs to a patient in need. As an EMS professional, theft and loss records, you don't want those to happen, the 106 form, because that could generate a DEA response. You're allowed to destroy drugs on your own via a 41. Your records, as Scott mentioned, have to be readily retrievable. This is a federal definition, and that usually means you have to be able to present them within a 2 to 4 hour window. And then paper records can be fine or electronic, but the electronic does give you a big advantage with the number of records an EMS would have. And back to you, Scott.
Yeah, and I think this comes down to what I found. Many folks end up starting with paper that those then get scanned, right? Which then you have to go into the scanner, you have to name it, and then you have to like file it somewhere and all that stuff. I think again, there are systems out there that actually do this and do this really, really well. And again, it comes back to if I'm a regulator, pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I need all of these documents from you," and you go, "Sure. Which the best way to get it to you, and when do you want it?" And I think that again takes me from here down to here. So. One of the things that I will say is this is the area that I have really probably the biggest concern is around diversion prevention and ensuring that again, as having had two people that I've worked with come up through the ranks with over the years end up having a diversion issue. Neither of them set out as Dennis said, going to, geez, today I would like to have a diversion or a drug problem. What I would say is this is one of those areas where, again, if you have good documentation and a good program in place, you usually can start to identify these things. And I don't know, I think Dennis, you were going to just touch base quickly on this, and I know we have another slide right after this on the diversion control program.
Yes, sir. You used to reiterate what you say. You always want to restrict your drug access to the limited amount of people you have and things like that. Hey, moving forward to the current slide. Uh, this is really DEA's diversion control program. DEA's a 10,000 person agency. Most of it is focused on fentanyl and heroin and cartels and gangs and the like and things like that. But a small part, around 600, 700 people, oversee DEA's pharmaceutical controlled substances, the morphine, the fentanyl, the benzos that EMS professionals use every day. And these are the powers, these 7 things, I'll hit them real quick here, that Congress gave this section of DEA to do. They help establish schedules with drugs, Schedule 1 through 5s, and consult with the FDA. They do registration, same thing as you or I registering a car, a truck, or our driver's license. They help to establish quotas, and that's been in the news because of the opioid epidemic in the last several years. ARCOS is simply a computer system that DEA uses that in theory tracks all the drugs around America, but it's just so voluminous, it's overwhelming. Security requirements, we touched on that. If you are a manufacturer or distributor, you have to keep your Schedule 2s in a bank type vault. And then record keeping is the core DEA regulation that DEA oversees. And then cyclic investigations, that's when DEA goes into a DEA registrant on a every year, every other year basis. DEA spends most of their time doing cyclics on manufacturers, distributors, and for some strange reason, they continue to do it on OTPs. So the likelihood of DEA knocking on an EMS door is about 1 in 100,000 because it's not really a high focus of DEAs. And back to you, Scott.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think is important, right? We know that we are a small subsection, right? I think what is it, like 0.9% of total national healthcare expenditures are spent on EMS. However, again, we have a lot of medications moving to a lot of different places at any one time. And I think if in fact there's an area for compliance challenges, it's us, right? Because for the most part, medications go into a hospital and they don't leave that hospital unless they're in someone's body for the most part, right? Or they're distributed out to an EMS agency in a restocking agreement. So again, this comes back to, and this is one of the things, and again, whether you use paper or whether you use a system like Clive's, right? One of the things that we do know is many of those systems automatically generate the forms that you need. They can do so and will properly track all of that information for you. And again, I would say don't paddle upstream if you don't have to. Any sort of diversion investigation, of course, you would handle in the same way you would handle any other issue in your organization. You would want to do immediate reporting. You'd want to do your own internal review, and then, of course, issue corrective actions. Hopefully, what you're looking for, if there's a diversion concern, it's not actually a diversion. It's just poor record keeping or maybe a failure to track all documentation. And I know, and by the way, I am seeing those questions pop up. We will go through these questions once we get through the slides here. Typically, I don't do it that way, but I think it makes sense today. So operational challenges, if you got multiple stations, certainly that's just one of your designated locations. Mobile inventory tracking, this is one of the things that, like I said, you can use tools like our sponsor today for the purposes of being able to do that. And then, of course, we run into issues, and part of how this came up were issues or challenges around hospitals and their interest or willingness to restock or enter into these agreements. Again, I think that was one of the reasons why they came up with an EMS registration, was so that you didn't necessarily have to rely on a hospital pharmacy. Compliance risks, for sure. If you fail to register, if your documentation is not there, again, I think, this is, to me, this is one of those that should be really pretty straightforward, right? Compliance, while challenging, is understandable, right? In other words, it is knowable, learnable, and it is something that frankly should be pretty straightforward. There aren't any surprises in this. Improper access, of course. Um, DEA enforcement, I don't know if our resident expert on the DEA wants to just comment quickly on, let's just say in the experience that you've had, what are EMS agencies looking at when it's something as simple as just a failure to maintain records appropriately versus something a lot more serious?
A great question, Scott. It's all subjective and it kind of depends on the person on the other end, the DEA person. But poor record keeping is usually a letter of admonition. I call it a warning speeding ticket for your first offense, maybe an MOA, a 3-year probation that DEA's looking at you. But again, DEA really doesn't focus that much on EMS. If they do hear of a diversion, they'll probably be interested. But as we talked, you just want to maintain good records, and usually on a small mishap on forgetting to do this record or that, DEA will you say, hey, correct it and do better the next time. Criminal liability, you've been on the ground with that one yourself, Scott, that you're aware of. That happens infrequently, but can happen. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah. So implementation checklist, really, I believe in checklist. And when somebody comes in, I say it for family medical leave, whether it's HIPAA, whether it's any of those things, that if you have a checklist, you can ensure that you're following a process. And again, that checklist can be electronic or it could be certainly paper. But what I would say is make sure that you go through, assemble all the information you're going to need, your organizational information, understand where your designated locations are. And then also recognize what is our process going to be for documentation, where that documentation is going to be maintained, and then ensuring that whatever policies you have to adjust as a result of the new regulations and your sort of recommitment to this process, that you recognize and go through that and have them reviewed by folks in your organization. Because again, if the way you're doing it, right, if the way that your folks are going to, if the meaningful operational way in which they're handling things is not consistent with your policies, it's a recipe for disaster, right? So you should include some of your field practitioners. So again, you're not creating a process that's going to be so problematic for them that in fact compliance is almost a guaranteed failure, right? So go through, update those policies. Talked about this, right? Understanding, what are your policies around diversion control, security, et cetera, who your authorized personnel are, and then some sort of certificate. If you want to register, go to the DA's website. We know that we already heard from some folks that you log in, you go to start the registration process. It says, we're sorry, you can't. This is one of those rules that interesting to me, and I'm not picking on anyone, but I am interested that this rule has been out there for this process, the train has been coming down the track for a long time. So the fact that some folks are like going to register and they go like, sorry, you can't. And then we're like, well, okay, again, geez, you should call the DEA. And I'm like, okay. Again, this is one of those ones that I'm a little surprised that there isn't more information available. I will tell you, there's a lot of folks writing about it, but very, very, very little direct guidance from the folks who regulate it. Again, we talked about these policies, and this is not just the book that you blow off and all the dust comes off. I love when a supervisor comes in and says, Scott, we should have a policy on X. And I go, that's a brilliant idea. So much so that we've had that policy for 5 years. Thanks for reading the policy manual. Future regulatory issues, of course, electronic drug tracking, DEA enforcement trends, state integration. I think where we're at right now is how do the federal and the state laws interact and what makes most sense for ensuring compliance, both at the state level and at the federal level. I think, again, what I started to do, and I realized it was going to take me a fair amount of time, was to try and build a matrix of all 50 states and the DEA regulations and how those things overlap. But I realized that was going to be, even AI couldn't have spit it out fast enough, because I will tell you, you look at the state regulations en masse, it tells you have to get DEA registered. The reality is you do not, right? You can, but you don't have to. So this is one of those things that's going to be pretty labor intensive. We will start working on it, but it will certainly take a fair amount of time. Again, confirm whether you have to, and this can be not only contacting, the best place to start is locally. contact your local controlled substance folks, possibly your EMS office. Again, a lot of folks don't go to their EMS office for their DEA stuff, but your EMS office probably has some knowledge about this and can direct you to the right place. Implement strong drug controls and ensure medical director oversight. Now, I want to hit some of those questions. And I don't know if Clive or Dennis, you have anything to add before we move on to trying to clean through some of these chats and questions.
Just really quick, that last slide about, talking to your EMS agency. Probably every EMS agency on this call has some sort of regional association that they're part of.
Yeah.
And there's power in numbers. And so talking with your peers and your neighboring agencies and so on, then going to your EMS agency as a group has so much more pull than just going there individually. And so that always works the best from my experience.
No, I think that's great. Well, let me hit some of these. I know we've lost a few folks because a lot of folks had calls that start at the top of the hour. And sorry, you always just ask a lawyer to say anything. They'll do it in 40 words, what could be done in 2. So, all right, let's go through. I'm going to hit the chat first, and then I'm going to come back. Does storage include storing medications in lock boxes in the ambulance for the shift, or only for bulk storage medication boxes ready for field use? Yes. Right? Storage is all of that, right? So storage is whether it be in the individual ambulances or whether it be in the registered location, whether it be in the designated location. Storage, the requirements around documentation and the securing of storage is for essentially from the time that medication gets to your registration location or into your control till the time that that's either used or destroyed or, wasted, etc. So I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that. I saw Clive, you won. Okay. But all drugs ordered from a big supplier, we already hit that. If a staff member takes a car home, does this mean their address? We covered that. Is no longer allowing carrying narcs on your person allowed? Any funding for small ambulance services to purchase safes? So they did talk in the regulations about carrying medications on your person. What they essentially said was, and they sort of made it the equivalent to carrying it in a jump bag, that it is permitted while you are responding to a request for service, but after that has to be locked back up. So what I will say to you is that's what the regulation says. In practicality, I know that many folks will leave, let's say, for example, the drug box that Clive showed earlier inside their first in bag, but their first in bag will typically either be locked in the cabinet or within the vehicle. Again, the goal is to prevent access, right? Not prevent access for you who are reasonably trying to use that, but to prevent access from somebody who shouldn't have access to it. So I hope, is there funding? No, not that I'm aware of. There may be go ahead, Clive.
So one of the things we found, and I found as a fire chief, is that when you open a new fire station or you start a new project, doesn't necessarily have to be EMS, but once you offer a new service to your community, and this might differ government versus private, there might be grants there either locally, federally, or state because you're now offering a new service. And so you're more likely, from my experience, to get a grant for a new service than an existing. And so if you're saying, hey, we're starting this new ALS program in this peripheral community, can we get some funding for new drug safes? And so it might not cover your whole agency, or if you're just starting out an ALS program, it might cover your whole agency. But it's always helpful to go and search. And there's grant writers out there you can find that will search this for you and save you some time. But if you're doing a new area, that's the best time to go look for grants for like these drug safes.
Yeah, and I know like often like Savick Foundation, Savick Buying Group often will have someone in the grant writing area and often will have or knowledge about where to possibly access funds for the purchasing, and as well as having already approved contracts. And I'm going to try and read this one, but forgive me, I'm not a medic. If we have CDS that were purchased under 222 for satellite location, can we move those to our main location to distribute out of our satellite locations? I think what they're asking is, can we move medications purchased one place to another place that is included as a designated location, from our registered location to our designated location, or from one designated location to another? The answer is yes. You just have to track it. Is that accurate, Dennis?
Yes, sir. Anytime you move opioids, you have to do it via 222. So if I took it like you did, if you want to transfer it from one registered location to another, you do it via 222. And many hospitals forget to do this, especially when they deliver drugs down to, like, say, an ambulatory surgery center. Same thing if it was a 3 through a 5. That's an invoice. You got to have paper showing where it went. Now, down to designated location, they require the same records, but they just call it a designated location. So an example of that is from, let's call it the hub, or I would say the mothership. The hospital is registered and it goes down to a designated location. You still have to keep the same records going down to that designated location. So a system like Clyde's, it's already got the 222s and the invoices in it. It's already built in to do it, even though you want to call it a 222, but in essence, that's what you're creating to show that transfer of drugs. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah. All right. What about an ambulance unattended in the garage in the station? Can the narcs still be left in the lockbox? I think that answer to that would be presumably yes, provided one, you're in a designated location and they are in fact locked in a substantially constructed cabinet. And of course, at any one given time, if I took a snapshot, where those drugs were. Anything related to restocking from supervisor to other crew, again, this comes back to you can do that, my understanding, under the regulations, but you have to have the paperwork, right, to show that transfer. Conflicts with treatment protocols, as in all meds are brought to the bedside. Again, I think this is permitted, provided you are responding to an emergency. Right, that was addressed. I see both of you are unmuted. Any comments on that?
Go ahead, Clive.
We've seen it where crews will take Versed in with them everywhere, but they'll leave the fentanyl on the apparatus, and they'll come back out for that just because they want to make sure that stays locked up at all times. But if you're on an emergency and leaving the drugs locked up will compromise patient care, then you can fully justify taking them in with you. And so if you're in an emergency and you take them with you, that's within the regulations.
Yeah, and it's clearly stated in the regulations. I think that's fair. If a hospital gives narcotics to the EMS crew for continuous infusion during transfer, does the documentation responsibility fall on the hospital or the crew? And again, I think the answer there is yes. Hospital has to document on their side, and you have to document on your side. Go ahead.
Really quick on that. As a medic, I'd always do my documentation as though nobody else was going to do theirs, just so that I made sure everything was covered. And so you want to assume that the hospital maybe is or isn't going to do theirs.
Right.
You document which nurse gave it to you, which doctor's order it was, all that information, the times. That way you are covered if anything ever goes wrong.
Yeah, and this comes down to, like, if you're a mandated reporter, don't ever go like, oh, well, I know they have to do it too, so I don't have to. No. Document on both sides. Suggesting reaching out to states and counties over opioid settlement dollars to cover the safes. I think that's a fantastic suggestion. Certainly worth reaching out to folks to see if there are any of those dollars. I know a lot of folks, as soon as those dollars came in, they were gone. Anyway, I'll just run through the questions here real quick and make sure that we answer them. And for those that can hang on, I appreciate it. We are losing folks, but that's okay. We still have almost 150 people on. If a vehicle is a designated location, does the building it's housed in also need to be a designated location? I asked more in relationship to my take-home chief's vehicle. I think we kind of answered this. You guys feel that way? All right. Let me go on. Next one. We operate under a LEMSA, which creates protocols we use. However, we receive our narcotics through the DEA number of our county's public health officer. He is not our medical director. So does this mean we need to register our county EMS department? Go ahead, Clive.
I would just say, and I think Dennis might be able to shed some light too, but I would say on anything like this, which it sounds like it might be outside the regulation, get everything in writing. And then as a fire chief, there's anything in the gray area, I would always share with the city attorney to make sure that she was in the loop of what I was doing and my EMS agency. So I wasn't out there saying, hey, I'm just going to go with what somebody told me. It was, this is what I'm told. We're going to operate in the best interest of our community. You tell me if you want us to do something different because this is deviating from the regulation, but all of you are now going to be involved with me.
Yeah.
And I second that, what Clive said. It's like documented, cover your bases. and then put DA on the spot. You send DA an email, you lay it out after you talk with your local people, your state people, and put them on the spot. Say, hey, this is what we plan to do. This is why. And oftentimes these regs just don't uh, tie to specific nuances. That's where everything's a little different out there in the field. So you just do your best, and Clive said it best. Back to you, Scott.
Yep. Just I know we had also in Texas here, our knocks are in the unit on the units are in lock boxes and sealed with tamper evident tags. That are then kept in locked cabinets. Our narcotics stored for restocking are locked in heavy duty safes with not with numerical access codes only assigned to supervisors. I mean, I think again, really, in addition to having the physical, this comes back to the administrative, technical, and physical safeguards, right? That we have like in HIPAA. I say it's sort of the same thing here, but I think that's a great plan. But by the way, provided that your physical location where the safe is actually a designated is on the designated location your DEA reg. In Texas, our medics carry minimal number of narcotics on their person. How would DEA look at this? I think we've answered that one. CDS are typical kept in locked boxes in the first due bag in the locked vehicle. If it was in a locked box, this would delay access on calls. I think we've answered this one to say, yep. If in fact they can be on your person during a response for an emergency for this exact reason. And again, I think I have seen in my 30 solid years on the street that really most of the time when there was an access issue was because someone didn't bring the equipment. And someone had to run down, or someone went down and realized that their partner had had the key to the lockbox. So again, I think we've answered that one.
Really quick, there
Go
are
ahead.
some safes out there. I can only speak to Knox because we work with them, but they have key cards to some of theirs. And so it makes the access a lot quicker, and they're uniquely identified so it knows if
Yeah,
it's
so
money.
like an R, but yeah, that's great from a tracking perspective, right? You can see who's been in and out of that cabinet. In Illinois, private services operate under direction of an SOGs of the hospital medical director, but we are not necessarily owned and operated by a hospital. Our narcotics are provided by the hospital pharmacy. Do we have to register with the DEA under the new rules? I didn't look specifically at Illinois' rules. What I would say is you can certainly go on to the DEA website and register, start the registration process. If they kick you out, like they did in Maine and in some other states, then you'll know. The other thing I would also do is one, contact the Illinois Office of EMS, and I would also contact the Illinois Office of Controlled Substances. Because again, remember, there are multiple laws at play here. And so in what I've found in the states where it's that registration is permitted, but in many states, but not required. So in this instance, again, as we were talking about, Clive and both Dennis said, make sure you've got all that on email, track all that down, follow it up. And again, I think if you go to try and register and the system won't let you, I would screenshot that. And I would also keep that as part of my records. This may be something you do not have the exact answer to, but do you have any thoughts on waste? I understand record keeping piece of it to some extent, but what about the physical waste at your registration site? I don't know if either one of you feel comfortable answering that. I think again, this comes back to documentation, right? If I'm not mistaken, in the regs they do talk about it. I think you handle waste the way you've been handling waste, provided it's compliant with not only your state regs, but again, it's really coming down to documentation. They want to know where did it go, and go ahead, Clive.
I just say that the DEA agent I spoke with years ago, and we'd go on a call, we would just squirt the rest of the morphine out on the ground. And when I talked to the DEA agent, she's like, no, you can't just squirt it around. You have to like dispose of it so it cannot be reconstituted. And granted, if it dries up on the asphalt, it really can't. But she was very specific that there are proper ways to destroy it. And so when you document how you did it, you want to be able to say it was done so that it cannot be reconstituted.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I did get a question. I think not answered in part, but answered in part. Are there DEA specific safe requirements or brands? They're not going to endorse a specific brand. What they're going to say is one of, I think what they say of adequate architecture such to prevent unauthorized access. And what I would say is it's got to pass the stink test, right? Like don't put it in a cabinet for like, where you can go in and just pop a knife to open the thing, right? Again, I think For example, there was a period of time where type 2 ambulances, if you locked yourself out, you could pop the license plate light out, grab the antenna off of the front of the truck, and open it with the antenna. Again, I don't know which one of us, DV and EMS, people might have figured that out, but access to the vehicle again was pretty easy. My general question is, can an EMS agency still work under the medical director's DEA registration, or are EMS agencies mandated to register to the new EMS category? From what was covered earlier, I think you said it depends on state law, and the answer to that is it does depend on state law. So you are going to want to contact your state controlled substance organization. Our EMS agency already holds a DEA registration that expires this fall. The new EMS registration, with the new EMS registration in place, should we renew or update our registration now, or simply wait until the renewal date? I think they're fine to wait till the renewal date if they already have an active registration. Yep, they're both nodding. So they are the subject matter experts on this one. I am just here. I'm like the talk show host on this one. If we purchase CDS under 222 satellite location, can we move them from our main register location? And the answer to that is yes. It sounds like yes, but you have to document it. If an organization has an MLP ambulance registration, would we need to apply for a new registration? An organization has an MLP ambulance registration. Would we need to apply for a new registration? And forgive me, but MLP, I don't know. I'm not picking up I'm sure one of you two probably go like, hey, knucklehead, it's this. But if you have an existing registration under federal law, then I would presume you need to do nothing until it needs to renew. If this is a state registration, you would want to make sure you don't also have to have in your state a DEA registration. Again, I would contact the local. You're going to want to talk to your controlled substance folks locally. Thank you for those who are attending. From New York State, we only have 2 more questions, and then I promise we'll let you go. From New York State, our medics carry their narcotics on their person for the entire tour. That is written in our New York State Controlled Substances Plan, Part 80. We are SSM, so medics go to both emergency and non-emergency. New York State has not to change anything until they give guidance, but they haven't given us anything yet. I saw that exact same thing in the Michigan memo that went out. So what I would suggest to you is, go ahead, Clive.
Well, I was just going to chime in that New York is also unique that it has requires a biannual audit. And so you have to submit an audit, I believe it's every June and December, or July and January, something like that, that is unique to New York. So individual states also have their unique requirements with their state EMS agency, but that's why it's important to note that New York does have that separate requirement, which the agency probably is aware of. I figure I'd throw that out there.
Yep, I think that's really, really helpful. And what I'd say is, don't be surprised. Sometimes, your state agencies are doing everything they can to keep up with their state actions. And the federal government has been a little challenging lately when it comes to new regulations and tracking, right? We have the OSHA rule. It's been out there now for over 2 years. At some point it will probably finalize, and then we'll all be rushing. If there are situations where controlled substance lacks documentation with proper waste procedure signatures at the time, and time has passed by, do these one-off situations have to be reported? This might be a great question for Dennis. So in other words, we identify, hey, yeah, we probably we don't have great documentation around this waste or the signatures. What's the best thing to do there?
Yeah, you don't have to report that. The only required reporting for DEA is a significant loss of drugs. So that's usually a diversion, and you should report that to DEA once you figure it out. I'll go back to DEA defines drug destruction and drug wasting differently. An example of drug destruction is expired drugs, or let's say Scott Moore or Clive drop a vial of fentanyl when they're taking care of a patient. That's drug destruction. You clean that up with a DEA 41. I call that the great inventory adjuster. Now, when you're drug wasting is what Clive gave a great example of, squirting it on the ground. That's the old school way, the same way we used to flush drugs at times at DEA. But the industry standard now is RX Destroyer, Deterra, these carbon-filled jugs that make the drugs non-retrievable. So that would be my best advice. Each ambulance should carry one of these drug-destroying containers on their ambulance, and then you need a witness, and you document them the day you waste it. And that's all you have to do. And that's the preferred method to waste drugs. You could use these same containers to destroy drugs, but the record keeping's different. The wasting goes on to a simple form. Drug destroying goes on to a much longer form. Back to you, Scott.
Actually, Clive, I think you got a comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick real world kind of guidance that I found works really well in this situation too. If you look and see a gap in your records or something that occurred, and what works really well is you contact your EMS agency on the phone verbally, just informally say, "Hey, we found some gaps in our documentation. I'm going to do a thorough report. I'm going to send it to you in the email. We don't need anything in response necessarily. I'm just going to tell you what happened and that we're going to do better in the future." And just so it's on the record. That way, that kind of is that email you then save, you print out, save a copy even after you retire. And that way, if anything ever comes back, you say, "Hey, look, we did an investigation.
Yeah.
We notified the EMS agency. They acknowledged it. Everyone promised to do better." And so that way you're covered down the road. So it's not just, "Hey, we found a gap. Let's just hope time pushes it back and people forget." It's like, no, no, we're doing a good job. We want to show that we're documenting well and we're taking care of our lethal drugs.
No, I think that's a great point. And MLP, thank you to Audrey, mid-level provider. We'll make an acronym out of anything. All right, correct. Semi-annual reports are done in January and July. Now, one more that came back up in chat. North Carolina here, we use Knox med vaults on every unit. Supervisor units track supervisors and track from receiving all the way through to waste administration through operative IQ. Our supervisors pick up the box from our main safe and fill our units. Anything else you suggest that we do? I mean, I think it's a function of as long as you are, tracking the medication. Again, it sounds like you are from the time you get it till the time that it's either wasted or administered. And each step along the way, it sounds like you're doing everything the way you should be. So go ahead, Clive.
Really quick, just whatever platform you're using, make sure they covered those 11 different key points that DEA requires. And so I don't know anything about Operative IQ, but there is some other companies out there that just do some basics that they don't cover those. And so whatever you're doing, because technically paper will work if you're doing everything spot on. It just has a lot of margin of error and human error. But make sure that those 11 key points are being identified in however you're managing your narcotics.
And offering that service, when you say, "Can you just verify the 11 key points?" They should be able to go, "Yes, you're all set."
Yeah.
Yep. And then, and quickly, because I know we're coming up on, 30 minutes is probably the longest we should hold anybody. But biometric and access card considered two locks? I think you may be focusing, those are keys, right? Those aren't locks, right? So you really want to get to what is it access by card or biometrics to a locked system considered two locks? And I think, my presumption would be yes, because arguably the tamper-resistant lock and then an actual physical lock would be sufficient. All right. With change from under medical direction to under agency, do we need to change ownership of drugs from under the old way medical director to the agency now, like the process we used when we changed medical directors? I think if you're going to register, right, you will then be purchasing the medications as the registrant. So I'm not sure if I'm hitting the question appropriately, but making sure if once you register, you'll be hitting it. You'll be purchasing the medications as a registrant. So if the registrant is such and such EMS agency, you're purchasing it as a registrant. When you're transferring it, if you're transferring it internally from registrant to designated location, right? Again, you're just tracking that on paperwork. If let's say, for example, a different registrant from the hospital is transferring it to one of your designated locations, then you would have that documentation and then make sure you notify the registrant of your own location within I think it's 72 hours, if I'm not mistaken, right? I think so. All right, guys. For 105 of you out of the original 200 we had, you all held on. I owe you two a drink at some point in the future because thank you for your willingness. Again, I'm just window dressing on this. I can read a regulation, but I don't really know how it works as well in practice. So I'm grateful to both of you all for joining and Clive for sponsoring. Really appreciate it. For those of you who haven't, go visit the websites. You can see here we've got again those links to contact should be will be in the PDF that Emily's sending out. So I'm going to hand it back to Emily to close us out because we are way overdue. So I'm so sorry. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Scott, Clive, Dennis. This was an amazing webinar, lots of engagement, lots of questions. And like Scott mentioned, for AAA members, this will go out in the next digest with the link to this on-demand recording, as well as the slides. And you can reorder it starting tomorrow with all of that information included. And with that, thank you all for joining and hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. All right, bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.